Well, why don't we talk codependency? I'd love it if you just share. There's a million definitions. Everyone's got a little slightly different one. What's your definition of codependency?
Oh gosh, codependency is driven by the concept that I'm going to work harder on your life than you are, and I'm going to sacrifice myself for you to take care of you, and then I'm going to be the victim. If that makes any sense.
Perfect sense.
Yeah. And where that comes from for me is that I was born and raised in Palo Alto, California, and I grew up in a house of addiction. We had a big, beautiful home with my dad was very successful, but we had a secret, and the secret was my mom was a prescription drug addict. And so our whole world was designed around keeping that secret and accommodating that situation. And then around 13, 14, I started using, drinking and using drugs, and, developed my own addiction. I mean, we can talk about what that looks like, but I mean, I'm an addict. And then when I was 26 or 27, my family confronted me, and I got sober through the 12-step recovery world, and have remained sober. Actually, a week ago today, wow. I celebrated 30 years.
Wow, congrats. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks. And then I went back to school and in 2008, and then I graduated in 2011 with a master's in marriage and family therapy from Regis. And then opened up my private practice in 2014, and swearing I would never work with addicts, alcoholics, and their families, because that stuff's crazy. And that's all I do.
Right, there you go.
All I do. And we have an office in Denver, an office here in Jacksonville Beach for therapy. And then I opened up the Chronic Hope Institute last year, which does family case management and education around the country.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your story. And I too, as I'm sure so many people, so many of AVAIYA students that are watching right now, grew up in a family of addiction. My father was an alcoholic and my mother codependent. And so, yeah, absolutely have developed a lot of those coping mechanisms over the years to that kind of environment. So what's the connection between codependency and addiction?
That's another great question. This is fun. Normally I have to explain everything. Yes. How I look at it is that, and I want to be clear that I'm also in 12-step recovery for codependency. Mm-hmm. I've been doing Al-Anon and adult children of alcoholics for years. I always say that addiction and codependency are like peanut butter and jelly. They can stand alone, but they really go together. When you have someone who has addiction, and let's be clear, addiction is, yes, it's the act of whatever they're doing, whether it's drugs, alcohol, gambling, shopping, porn, you pick it, but it's the using of the substance or whatever that is, but it's also the behavior pattern that goes with it. It's the lifestyle that goes with it. It's the unmanageability. When you're interacting with other people, which is what you have to do to survive, those other people tend to accommodate the addiction. And they don't realize it because it's generally something that's ingrained in them generationally over time. Families, I love the work, people I work with, I love, because the first question I always ask is, what's the history of mental illness and addiction in your family? And they're like, oh, there is none. There's literally no history in any generation whatsoever as far back as we can trace. But then they'll start telling me their family patterns. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting, because that's very heavy passive aggressive. That's very heavy codependence. That's very heavy manipulative and enabling. And that comes from having an addict in the house that you're having to sort of swirl around and deal with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how they coexist together. Mm-hmm. I normally I say pizza and beer, but yeah.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I totally do. Yeah. So here's a question, and this is kind of something I've personally explored in my own recovery from codependency, and I too have done and continue to do 12-step work with Coda. And I often think of my own codependency as an addiction. Like I have an addiction to drama in relationships, but I sometimes like think that might be I don't know, maybe too harsh or something like to call it an actual addiction, but gosh, that's kind of what it feels like. The compulsion is very strong. So do you have any thoughts there?
Oh, sure. How much time you got?
Just a few.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I fully believe that it is an addiction, and it's an addiction to control and managing people. And here's the thing, and I think this is critical for people that are struggling with codependency to understand. You come by it honestly. It's not that you wake up one morning and you're like, I am literally going to control everything around me. It's something you're taught as a child. It's a survival mechanism as a child. I mean, you said you grew up in a house of addiction, so did I. If you want to get through the day, you learn how to cover for people. You learn how to solve problems. You learn how to do your own laundry and clean the house and cook, at a very, very early age, because nobody else is going to do it. Or they might do it, but it's super inconsistent, so you don't know. So, it's the idea of presenting to someone that, hey, your codependence is also an addiction. And when you can start breaking it down to what you're doing, you're addicted to controlling your environment because you want your life to settle down and be safe.
Right.
And the only way you know how to do that is by controlling other people. And it's worked for you for X amount of time, but then eventually it stops working, because the ultimate truth is you have no control over other people.
Yeah.
It's this supposed belief system that you have that you're somehow making the trains run on time, and that's why everything's working out. And then when things fall apart, it's like, well, I have failed. It's like, no, you didn't fail. You just need to understand that's not your responsibility.
Right.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Thank you. That was really brilliantly said, because that has definitely been my experience. And control is one of those big things. I mean, man, it is an everyday, every moment experience of trying to let go of it. And, oh my God, right, I'm not in control. Oh my gosh, my higher power's in control. Oh my gosh, it's not about, like, I don't have to move all the puzzle pieces around, and but it's hard. It's definitely hard when, like you said, especially as it relates to safety, because that's what we're trying to do, So do you have any, I guess, suggestions for people AVAIYA students who are watching right now, who are like, man, how in the world am I going to let go of trying to control other people if this has been my pattern for so long?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, well, that's why I wrote both. I have two books. One's called Chronic Hope, Parenting the Addicted Child, which is designed for a family that has somebody, in high school or college or still living at home. And then the other book I just released, I believe in January, it's called Chronic Hope, Families in Addiction. And I wrote that book because what I wanted to give people was a step-by-step process of how to deal with the addict in the family and how to address the situation, how to set boundaries, how to hold them accountable. That's the first phase. Then the second phase is, how does the family start dealing with the family stuff, the stuff we're talking about? Because like you said, there's a safety issue. I mean, we have to do something about someone who's actively using drugs and alcohol, because they could kill themselves,
Right.
So we have to set a limit and a boundary and hold them accountable and put together a plan. And I'm big on step-by-step plans. I'm sure that's got a lot to do with my childhood,
Right.
Very linear direction. But then, the second phase is really digging into the family and saying, okay, now that we've got this person help, now let's do some help for the family. Let's start taking a look at our stuff.
AVAIYA has changed my life.
AVAIYA has made me the woman I am today.
AVAIYA is my home.
AVAIYA is personal freedom.
AVAIYA is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about AVAIYA.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, AVAIYA, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at AVAIYA is what the world needs.